I work for the Electronic Frontier Foundation, where I look at censorship and surveillance issues. I'm particularly interested at the intersection of corporations and states on both of those things. For example, a lot of my work deals with censorship in the ways that states pressure private companies to engage in censorship on their behalf, as well as the way that private companies serve the state through their own corporate regulations on speech. EFF is a nonprofit. It's a registered 501c3 in the US, which means that we can accept donations tax-free from US citizens, of course, but we also accept donations from others. But really the best way to support us is to become a member. We have a membership program that ranges from a student price of something like it's $65 a year to much higher levels for those who can afford it. But that's something that ensures that we have sustainable funding year after year. And a lot of our funding does come from individual donors, which is something we're really proud of.
If you have something that you don't want anyone to know, maybe you shouldn't be doing it in the first place. But if you really need that kind of privacy, the reality is that search engines, including Google, do retain this information for some time. And it's important, for example, that we are all subject in the United States to the Patriot Act. It is possible that that information could be made available to the authorities.
Privacy is a right that we should all have. And there are a lot of different, philosophical conceptions of privacy and why it's important. And a lot of those do revolve around, the desire to keep things private often comes down to shame. And why do we have shame? Because there are things in society which are taboo, there are cultural differences that, something that I might do might be offensive to someone else or might not go along with their ideals about the world. And so, privacy is not something that we're going to be able to get rid of. We can't extract all shame from culture. And so, it's also something that gives us power. It gives us personal power to be able to protect our beliefs, our expression, all of these things. I don't think privacy is dead, but I do think that right now we're under a unique threat from this, collaboration between corporations and states, both in terms of wanting to surveil us for, things like marketing content to us, marketing products to us, but also the bulk capture of citizens of various states by various governments, the bulk capture of our data that we don't know how it's being used, and the fact that it's being collected means that it can be used at any point in the future against us. A lot of what's being collected, for example, by the National Security Agency in the US it's mostly metadata. And metadata is things like the dates of our communications, your phone number, your email address being connected to me, the time that I sent something to you. And so when one of these things by itself doesn't necessarily mean anything. But if a state is capturing all of your communications and they see, who you contacted, when you contacted them, and they're able to triangulate those different things, it actually paints a rather complete picture of what you're doing. And this is a way that a state actor, or even a non-state actor that's engaged in that kind of surveillance, can later triangulate that information and use it to prosecute or whatever. It doesn't matter whether the activity that you're engaged in is illegal. And I think that that's something that a lot of people say when they're confronted with the idea of surveillance. They say, oh, but I have nothing to hide. I'm not doing anything wrong. And I think that this is, it's a difficult argument to counter, but it's also a really problematic one because, first off, even if you don't have anything to hide, maybe the people in your network do. And so if you're a journalist, you need to protect your sources, for example. That's something that people easily understand. But activists don't often see it that way because they say, okay, I'm brave, I'm willing to put my information out there, and I'm not worried about the risk. And that's fine, that's a personal choice. But we need to be concerned about the other people in our network who may be more vulnerable than us. And so, for example, I'm a person of privilege, I'm from the US, I'm not very concerned personally about being surveilled, but at the same time, a lot of the people that I communicate with are, more vulnerable groups in the United States or people in other countries who have much more active surveillance concerns, and I need to make sure that I'm protecting them as well as myself. One of the things that we see every time there's a terrorist attack, we see governments leap to say that the answer to solving that problem is surveillance, and then also to a lesser degree censorship. So we say, okay, governments will say, we have to convince Facebook to take down all terrorist content, to do it within 24 hours, to put penalties on them if they don't, that sort of thing. There's a lot of problems with that, of course. First, what is terrorist content? Who's defining that? Is it a company defining it? Is it a state? If so, is that state an honest actor in the definition of who constitutes a terrorist? And so, forgetting for a moment the people who actually do engage in violent acts or in acts of terrorism, there's a whole number of other people who, just by virtue of their family connections or where they're from, get caught up in that. And so I think that, governments paint Muslims and other groups as well, but right now Muslims, as the other in order to justify this surveillance that then affects all of us. We've seen that the Patriot Act and Section 215 have not effectively prevented any terrorist attacks, and in most cases, as you know, governments have the information on these people already, and they're not doing anything with it. So the first reaction of governments is to say that surveillance is a solution to terrorism, or is the solution to terrorism, and it's not, because it doesn't tackle the actual cause. A lot of, governments are not interested in looking at the root causes because they have a vested interest in perpetuating these things. They have a vested interest in building up the security state, building up the police state. And so, from my perspective, I hate to be this cynical, but I see this as, as a way to expand the surveillance program without actually solving the problem, so that they can keep growing it and keep surveilling all of us. And so right now the target's Muslims, but it will be more people eventually. And it already is in some
And I mean doing more to restrict the freedom and movements of terrorist suspects when we have enough evidence to know they are a threat, but not enough evidence to prosecute them in full in court. And if our human rights laws stop us from doing it, we'll change the laws so we can do it.
I thought that was, one of the more bold statements that I've heard from a government or from a politician. And I think that, there's this kind of justification that happens and it does very much concern me to see liberal democracies engaged in this, because they're absolutely following in the footsteps of authoritarian governments, and in many cases working directly with them. I mean, that's the thing that I think that a lot of people forget when they're not concerned about the US. They say, okay, under Obama, there were a lot of people who said, oh, but surveillance isn't that big of a deal because Obama's not going to use it against us. First off, that's wrong. Second, what about the next government? Now we see what's happening there. And third, we set an example. Liberal democracies should be setting an example, and right now they're instead, setting the example and putting in place the basis for other governments to jump on this as well. So it's concerning on so many different levels. The ability to grow the surveillance state is absolutely based around this idea of defining one enemy. But in the past, it was what? Communists. And so in the next, it will be someone else. And I think that this is exactly how, the surveillance state builds and is able to later infiltrate, or later or concurrently infiltrate other movements. By finding this one target, then expanding the surveillance state, and it absolutely gives the executive power more power to go after all of these different social movements, not just through signals intelligence and mass surveillance, what we've been talking about, but also human intelligence and infiltration. And I do have a really hard time with the fact that the anti-surveillance movement has focused most on personal responsibility, on using crypto, things like that. At the same time, I think that it's imperative. We have to take responsibility and utilize these tools, because ultimately there's very little that we can do to prevent the state from even overreaching past legislation, protections that have been put into place. But at the same time, we have to attack it from all sides, through legislation, through strategic litigation, and through education, and changing the paradigms around surveillance. But I also feel that as a white American person, I am always concerned about overstepping my bounds and working in other movements. And, people often will say, like, well, why are you working on surveillance in Egypt, for example, which is something that I've done? Shouldn't you be focused at home? And my answer to that is that governments are working together sometimes when it's not even in their best interest, right? You have the US and Saudi Arabia collaborating. Since when was Saudi Arabia actually a friend of the US, let alone anyone else? And so if these states are collaborating together, then we absolutely have to set up a new paradigm of solidarity across movements. And that doesn't mean overstepping bounds and stepping on other people's movements and all of that, but it does mean working together across these movements and making sure that, when we talk about encryption, like I said before, part of the reason for it is not protecting yourself, but protecting the people in your network. And another aspect of that is that the more people who use tools, the more protected that we are. If you're the only person using it, then you're much more of a target for a state. But if we get these things out into the mainstream, if we get everyone to use encryption tools, then no one is singled out for doing so. And I think that that's, just one basic, it's an example, it's not the full solution, but it's one basic example of how movements can work across with each other and work to, get these tools out into the public, get these ideas out into the public, and create mass adoption of them so that everyone is a little bit safer. But one of the things that we also tried to do is not only make the tools easy to understand and use and try to pick tools that people could actually get a grasp on, but also to talk to people not just about state surveillance, but about all the different kinds of surveillance that they can be affected by. One of the things that people don't talk about a lot and that I think has gotten missed often in the conversation around the Snowden revelations is that a lot of surveillance happens on a much more personal level. For example, domestic abuse. These tools that are built for example, for parents to monitor their kids are often used by abusive partners. And that's something that, just hasn't really been part of the surveillance conversation. And so we've tried to work that in. We've tried to build kind of playlists that speak to different groups, so journalists, for example, or victims of domestic abuse, different kinds of groups, and really, try to explain not just how the tools work, but why it's important and how you can think about your own risk and your own threats that you face. And so some of the questions that we tell people to ask themselves are, what sorts of risks am I facing? How likely is it that I'm actually going to come under threat? And then also, how much effort am I willing to put into it? I think that's a really important question, because often people will say, oh, just use Tor or use PGP, but that's there's huge barriers to entry for people who are not very technologically savvy. And so if you're not willing to put in that much, but you have a high risk, there are a couple of things that you can do to significantly increase your safety. That in exposing what Western governments have been doing, we haven't done enough yet to expose the way that they're collaborating with other states. So for example, the NSA is, a lot of the programs are aimed at non-citizens of the US and non-residents of the US. And we have to assume, we don't have all of the information, but we have to assume that they're sharing some of that information in some cases with repressive governments. I would look, for example, at some of our allies in the Middle East that the US may be handing over some data to. Again, we don't know for sure, but we have to assume that that's happening, at least on some level. These governments are all cooperating in the war on terror. So I think that's the first thing, is exposing that and making people aware not only of how their government is surveilling them, which often, people are intimately aware of their own governments, but they're often not aware of how other governments are targeting them. So that's one thing. And then I think also, going back to this idea of solidarity within these movements, I do a lot of trainings internationally on digital security. I've learned more from people that I've trained than I learned from anyone who trained me, honestly. Because the more I go to different places, I learn about different ways that people are affected, different kinds of tools that people are using. And so I think that, as people who have the privilege and the knowledge on digital security, I think it's really important to listen to communities and find out exactly, find solutions that fit their needs, and not just try to say, okay, you have to use this tool or this tool. And that's something that I think the movement has missed a little bit too over the years, although they're getting better. One really positive thing, since there's been a lot of more depressing things over the past couple days, one really positive thing is that the digital security training community is very international, and there have been a lot of people from global south countries and from marginalized groups in Western countries who've been kind of stepping forward and saying, like, this isn't working. The way you're doing this is not working. Here's how we need you to do this. And I think we have to listen.
Est-ce que la France va accorder l'asile politique à Edward Snowden
Ce n'est pas
comme réfugié
l'actualité, je ne vois
politique?
pas pourquoi nous le ferions.
Oui. Vous n'êtes pas favorable?
Je n'y suis pas favorable, mais si la question se pose, elle sera bien sûr examinée.
By not giving Edward Snowden asylum, which we were talking about before, by not doing that, that also enables them to point and say, look, he's collaborating with Russia, look, he's in Russia. But really, these countries left him no other solution. What else was he supposed to do? I've realized that there's a lot of criticism for the countries that he chose to go to, but I don't blame him when he was trying to protect himself from, possibly the rest of his life in prison. And I think that, these acts are heroic, and it's also, governments are trying to send a warning to make sure that there aren't more whistleblowers. I don't feel that we can rely on the states to do that. There are no, there are states that did stand up and offer asylum to Edward Snowden, to Julian Assange, but I don't think that generally we can rely on the states to protect whistleblowers. And even then, if you're relying on one state to protect a whistleblower from another state, that's an unsustainable solution as well. So as individuals, or as collectives, as humans, it's a tough question, because, Chelsea Manning has enough visibility that people were able to fundraise enough money for her to live for the next year or so, which is fantastic. But that's also, a very privatized, very kind of NGOized solution. We need a popular movement to stand up against state surveillance, and we can't just, the Snowden revelations were 4 years ago now. We've made a lot of progress in making people aware of it. Now we need to make more progress in getting people to stand up against it.